called black metal music and encourages devil worship and the desecration of churches.
When I heard it, almost a cold shiver goes down your spine. What is all this about?
The ban, a form of music, they say, has disturbing satanic overtones.
Become almost absorbed in it.
Welcome to Blackfold, a black metal podcast. My name is Danny van Eyck. I've been fascinated by black metal for decades. Not so much by the music at first, but all the more by the tales behind it, the mythology, the villainous characters who inhabit both the music and the scene, the constant pushing of boundaries, whether they were musical, in the embrace of evil, or through the actual crimes, the arsons, kidnappings, torture, even murders. It never ceased to amaze me how many extreme things happened in such a relatively small scene. However, it never did much to warm me to the actual music. That was until September of 2021, when my family suffered a terrible loss. The mourning period following this, weirdly enough, I spent going down the black metal rabbit hole. I started listening to the classics. I read up on bands, spent hours, days, weeks, and then months digging ever deeper into a seemingly endless catalog of blast beats, tremolo picking, and maniacal screams. I enjoyed lo-fi recordings, and I was blown away by the more high-fidelity releases. I had found a project to take my mind off of the grief, and I was thankful to have this music become the lifeline that it turned out to be. This podcast is my attempt at sharing my newfound fascination, and dare I say it, even love for this music. It is a scattershot approach at examining some of the pillars of the genre, delving into some of the key players of its past, its present and its future, going over some of the themes of the music, and of course, diving into some of the more extreme things that define black metal's history. And although this history is indeed a defining feature of the genre, and an important element of this podcast, I also want to look at today's music, as well as the future of the scene. I don't want this to be a repeat of things people know about intimately already, but there are certain relatively well-known stories that deserve to be talked about all the same.
Today's episode will be different though, as I look deeper into the themes and music of the scene by focusing on one of the main, leading us into a subgenres. When it comes to metal in general, fans like to talk about the diversity in the music. For every genre, there are at least a couple of subgenres or genre combinations that have become genres unto themselves. And black metal is no different. Whether we are talking about the timeline, geography, theme, instrumentation, playing style, or anything else, there is bound to be a label adhered to it. Some fans would argue that we just need to look at when the music was recorded and won't entertain any notions of more than what wave the music originates from. It is either first, second, or third wave, and even that last one can prove controversial. Others, though, would expand happily on the dozens of subgenres already recognized by a majority of fans. Aggressive black metal, atmospheric black metal, brutal black metal, dark black metal, epic black metal, symphonic black metal, experimental black metal, progressive black metal, ambient black metal, avant-garde black metal, raw black metal, technical black metal, black and roll, depressive suicidal black metal, folk black metal, war metal, industrial black metal, post black metal, pagan black metal, satanic black metal, Viking black metal, unblack metal, whatever that is, National Socialist black metal, assholes, red and anarchist black metal, cosmic black metal, black gaze, void gaze, black and crust, black and death metal, black and doom metal, black and grindcore, black and noise, black and sludge metal, triumphant black metal, black and thrash metal, black and speed metal, Scandinavian black metal, Norwegian black metal, Swedish black metal, Finnish black metal, Icelandic black metal, US black metal, Cascadian black metal, Appalachian black metal, Rocky Mountain black metal, German black metal, Hellenic black metal, occult black metal, true black metal, Celtic black metal, and on the list goes. Today, however, I want to talk about yet another type of black metal, medieval black metal. Of course, having the first episode of Blackfall be about a relatively well-known figure in Dead, and then spending a lot of time telling music fans that the theistic basis of their favorite genre is basically theatrics, while now moving on to discussing a subgenre that many won't even consider actually being one, I run the risk of alienating an already notoriously difficult to please group of listeners. But if I haven't pissed you off in the first run of episodes, then what good of a black metal podcaster would I be? There can be no denying, however, that the Middle Ages play an important role in black metal. Whether it's thematic, through instrumentation, iconography, or in stage shows, there's a medieval heart that beats in a certain section of the scene, and today I'm eager to talk about it. Perhaps, or most likely, the reason I'm picking up this specific segment of the music is once again completely self-involved. As I've mentioned before, I've only relatively recently gone from someone interested in black metal to an actual fan of the genre. And one of the albums that made this happen was the reasonably well-received Morgenrödens Helvestere by Danish black metal band Heltigvat. Lead singer and multi-instrumentalist Ole Pedersen Luke, also of Afski and Solbred fame, screams like a complete and utter maniac. And there are samples of swords drawn, flutes and other old-timey instruments. The medieval character of the project seems to mostly be a thematic one. The album cover displays a detail from the larger painting King's Fountain painted by an anonymous Flemish artist. It shows dark-skinned knight Jao de Sa, who lived from 1524 to 1567, so by all accounts after the Middle Ages, which officially or semi-officially started in 500 AD and ended in 1500 AD. Zhao had a meteoric progression through the royal court in his mere 43 years of life. The man went from slave to court jester to gentleman courtier to an actual member of the military order of St. James of the Sword. So yes, the first album I picked to discuss in a podcast episode about fringe music's not universally recognized subgenres is a relatively standard black metal album, albeit a great one, that eschews actual medieval music for themes and intros and then, knowingly or not, places itself squarely outside of the medieval era. Yet of course that is the whole point. Medieval imagery fits so well with the black metal aesthetic that it's a no-brainer. And who cares about a century more or less, especially now in 2024. From the first days of the genre, the Dark Ages, and clearly the centuries after, have been a staple of the imagery, the lyrics, and the overall expression of black metal. Helped in large part by a nostalgia for pre-Christian Norway in the heyday of the Black Circle, and the love for Tolkien's work in role-playing games that shone through in much of Buursum's early work. Knights, castles, and Gothic architecture and art quickly took hold in the scene. For this episode though, I want to focus on the actual Middle Ages influence on the scene. Not the ones inhabited by orcs, goblins, and rampaging giants, but the centuries where Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe. Not the worlds where dragons guard fair maidens, but the ones where crusades were launched against a different enemy, one of faith. And not the one where magic missiles take out chaotic evil necromancers, but the actual world, where the Black Plague killed over 50 million people in a little under 7 years. It are these themes that we see expressed in the artwork of France's Peste Noirs, they're literally named after said pandemic. Albums like La Sanie des siècles, Panégyrique de la dégénérance, are quite successful in employing this imagery to relay a sense of being out of time that this music underlines. Listening to the music is a bewildering experience. Take album highlight Douai Angoisseuse, for instance. We hear acoustic guitars, leading us into a mid-tempo guitar rock song with perhaps the most insane vocals ever committed to vinyl. Nijsch, their former drummer and current mastermind behind black metal / shoegaze band Alcest, must have had a sore throat for days after. It is unlike anything you might have heard before, yet is so in keeping with the general aesthetic of the artwork and theme, it is eerie. And it becomes even more so when you find out that the lyrics were in actuality written in Middle French by Italian-French poet Christine de Pizan in late 14th or early 15th century France. The title translates to anguish grief and is a lamentation on the death of her husband. So, let's see. We have imagery, music, and lyrics. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that medieval black metal is a thing. Okay, there's an elephant in the room, and I'm no longer able to ignore it. Much of black metal, and especially that of the past, is made by horrible people. Of course, a general misanthropy and disillusionment is to be expected for what is the most extreme of extreme music, and the people who make it. Having a pantheon of originators that consists of murderers, animal torturers, terrorists, and arsonists is of course one of the pillars of the genre's mythology. A lot of the people in the scene like to ham up their so-called evilness as a stage act or a musical persona, and then when you meet them at the merch stand they turn out to be friendly, interested and very approachable people. Some are even downright sweet. I'm looking at you here, Hell Ripper. But there are of course a large number of groups that do not deserve the benefit of the doubt, and Peste Noire, and especially its main member, Famine, is one of those. It is impossible to make a podcast about black metal's past, present and future without touching upon some truly despicable individuals and groups. It is also impossible for me to not be outspoken about what I think and feel of these people and the ideas they propagate. I already let that slip during this podcast short run, but I'm not going to continue doing so every time we discuss someone of dubious moral character. This podcast will be twice as long, repeating myself quite a bit. So let me be clear in stating that when I discuss Birdsum, I do not agree with Vikernes' stances. When I discuss Peste Noire, I do not endorse the fascist asshole behind it. Fuck it, if I discuss Michael Jackson, I'm not defending pedophilia either. And yes, I unequivocally believe that Michael Jackson diddled kids. Fight me. The people behind Black Vault hate Nazis, fascism, homophobia, xenophobia, racism, and transphobia. And we believe that National Socialist Black Metal, the NSBM for short, is a shit stain on the music we enjoy. And if you're of the mind that all these things and any other extreme right political ideology are things you can ignore while listening to those making it, then good for you, I guess. However, if you believe in the message these bands put forth, then this might not be the podcast for you. Because I personally hate what you believe in and what you stand for. And I just wanted to make this absolutely crystal clear. I also am not interested in receiving messages, hate mail, or any other correspondence on this. And that includes, but what about the ultra-left? They're just as bad. Or any variations on the, so you want to silence people you don't agree with politically. Fuck you. Take it somewhere else. Having said all that, Nijsch, the person responsible for this song, has always maintained that he was never involved in anything political. And to be frank, He was only 15 at the time of his involvement with Best de Noir, and has often stated that he was just excited to scream, be able to play drums in a black metal band. He has since distanced himself from his involvement very vocally, and for my love of Alcest, I'm happy he did. Okay, back to the episode.
Owen! Andrew! Owen!
Luke Skywalker stands in the twilight overlooking the smoldering corpses of his Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru. Their farmstead burns in the background as thick smoke billows along the screen. 4 notes are heard.
Help me, Clarence! Get me back! Get me back! I don't care what happens to me! Get me back to my wife and kids! Help me, Clarence, please! Please! I want to live again!
George Bailey runs along a snow-covered bridge at night and looks over its edge, while he calls out to God, telling him he wants to live again. Bilbo stares at his palm. In it, the One Ring shines up at him. The following notes play out, and he drops it to the floor. A paleontologist climbs a disconnected electric fence to escape a rampaging dinosaur, while his wife is running through the bowels of Jurassic Park in order to get the power back up. These 4 notes have been used by composers as a harbinger of doom in movies and TV shows for close to 90 years at this point. Yet, its history reaches a lot further. In fact, it dates back to the earliest times of medieval music. Its name is Dies Irae. During the 9th and 10th century, monks started to chant Latin religious texts in what is now known as Gregorian chant, and quickly replaced most other forms of chanting that had existed before that. It is the first truly medieval music that we know of. As of the 300 years of music before that, little or no written history remains. Now, often referred to as the Dark Ages, the earliest part of the Middle Ages remain and maintain a reputation that it is undeserving of. The name itself comes from the fact that a lot of its history was lost to time, as little recorded history was prevalent of this age, or at least it was before their rediscovery at a later stage. Unfortunately, and whether or not part of the name consisting of the word dark has anything to do with it, the beginning of the Middle Ages are often seen as a time of anguish, pain, and backwardness. Even worse, by now, often the entirety of the Middle Ages are referred to by this name, Dark Ages, which is already wrong to begin with, but it also does a terrible injustice to the actual time period. The Middle Ages were in fact a period where huge strides were made in the fields of education, medicine, and engineering. It was the time when the first university of Europe was founded in Bologna. It was the age where we began to understand the actual state of the universe. And it was also the time when the arts became an ever more important part of society. As with most art during this period of time though, religion was a huge benefactor to the development of painting, masonry and music. And seeing how the Christian church was basically the only one major religion in Europe at the time, Christianity was the basis for a lot of the medieval musical development to follow. Which makes it a strange bedfellow for the music so often considered satanic, black metal. But ever since legendary second wave band Satyricon put out their debut and classic record Dark Medieval Times, the Middle Ages have been very intertwined with the genre, and some bands have taken that inspiration quite a bit further. Hi, Danny here. Just a quick thank you for listening to our podcast. We are happy to know that people are listening to the content we've created, and we truly hope that you are enjoying it. Making an hour-long weekly podcast is a pretty time-consuming side job, but it is one we love to do. However, that is something that I myself pretty much took for granted when listening to other podcasts. Hours upon hours of research go into writing one of these episodes. And our editor and producer then spend a lot of time checking my stories and then making them somewhat listenable for you. So what do we ask in return? Nothing. This show is free, and it will remain free forever. We believe in putting out a quality product that is enjoyable for almost everyone. However, we did set up a Patreon for the show, and if you can afford it, then we would welcome your patronage. But only if you can afford it. We have not planned anything specifically for patrons, and we are not eager to do so, as we do not believe in making our content exclusive to people who are able to pay for it. But we do welcome any donations you wish to make. So, you can head on over to patreon.com/Blackfold podcast and leave us a small tip if you want to. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a 5-star review anywhere you can. And now, back to the podcast. Gregorian chant is eerie. There's no doubt about it. At least, not to me. It is also hauntingly beautiful. Yet it conjures up images of robed monks hiding their faces behind dark hoods in alcoves of dank medieval cathedrals, performing secretive rituals performed in a language that none of the attendees spoke. It has always held a mystical, yet somehow shadowy image to those listening to it. Something that comes across in its use in cinema and other musical ventures. German New Age electronica, experimental, or whatever you want to call them, pop group Enigma, had an enormous hit in 1990 with the song Satanist Part 1, in which they combined actual recordings of Gregorian monks, a breakbeat borrowed from James Brown and Soul to Soul, and the sexual moans and whispered lyrics of one of the musician's wives. The title of the song refers to famous pornographer for his time, Marquis de Sade, and the track is still viewed as one of the most sensual dance tracks ever recorded. However, Larry Flick of Billboard magazine was quick to point out that the song had managed to already raise the ire of religious groups for its use of traditional Gregorian chants within the context of orgasmic groaning and tribal hip-hop grooves. Because, well, of course it did. Gregorian chant developed in the middle of the Middle Ages as a synthesis between Old Roman and Gallican chant, and it became a staple of the church's rites. The slow, monophonic chanting and reciting tones are as much a part of the church's legacy as their traditional dress, their unchallenged wealth, and their sexual abuse of the children in their care. Obviously, the misuse of their chants in a song about an imprisoned sex-addicted nobleman while a woman was climaxing in the background rubbed them the wrong way. One can only imagine how they would feel about the chant's later abuses. The song you just heard is Nous sommes d'hier by French one-man band Sunopfer, and that one man goes by Abigor. And throughout his music, medieval instrumentation, chanting, and atmospheric samples of horses and trumpets keep adding to a vision of the Dark Ages such as it has been depicted in the most visceral movies and novels. Mud, horses, warfare, cold and damp dungeons and death are just some of the visions that spring to mind when listening to the onslaught of what Abigor himself calls Baroque black metal. Because, hey, why not add another number to the list? And Sonhofer is not the only one to use Gregorian chants in black metal, as there are quite a lot of bands that have experimented with the centuries-old plain chant. Deathspell Omega, Hesychast, Funeral Mist, Mephorash, and even Rotting Christ are among the bands who have experimented to a greater or lesser extent with this medieval chanting in their work. Standouts, in my opinion, would be Batushka, who at one point were quite the talk of the scene. However, there are more ways in which the Middle Ages influenced the sound of the genre, and instrumentation is a part of this to a large extent. The use of acoustic instruments like Spanish guitars, lutes, harps, flutes, and even church organs are an example of old-style instruments making an appearance in many a rock and metal album over the years, and often are employed to add a folksy charm to the proceedings. Folk in itself is a term that props up swiftly and often when discussing medieval metal. And it's good to establish a difference between what the term means as opposed to what people think of when they hear it mentioned. Folk music means music played by and for commoners, the folk. It was played around campfires and in marketplaces, and varies wildly depending on where and when it originated. A traditional folk tune from Ireland is not going to sound anything like one from Nepal. They, however, do hold a number of things in common. Songs were part of the oral traditions, meaning that they were passed on between singers and players without being written down. And of course, what happens when you only get to talk about something before taking it on the road? Variations are born.
Farewell and adieu to you fair Spanish ladies. Farewell and adieu, you ladies of Spain. For we've received orders for to sail back to Boston. And so never more shall we see you again.
As my wife will happily attest to, I will never miss any opportunity to talk about Jaws. It is, in my opinion, still the best movie ever made, and I will fight anyone who disagrees. The voice we just heard is that of Robert Shaw, who, in the movie, played a shark hunter local to Amity Island by the name of Quint. Now, Quint is a character, and throughout the movie he embodies the fear of sharks as opposed to Richard Dreyfuss's Hopper, who seems to genuinely love the creature they are hunting. But Quint is a sailor, an old-school traditional sailor at that, so it's no surprise that he is the one to start singing the age-old sea shanty we just heard called Spanish Ladies. And this song was first sung by the men of the Royal British Navy while they were traveling from Spain back to the Downs, somewhere toward the end of the 16th or the beginning of the 17th century. And there are an astounding number of variants of this song known today, and many more that would have been lost over the years as the song literally traveled the world on board of the ships carrying its singers. And that is how songs traveled for a very long time. These folk songs often traveled with their interpreters as they moved from place to place, willingly or unwillingly, because blues and jazz, for instance, were born from the slave trade, which took the rhythmic songs from the African origin and planted them along with their exploitative labor in American soil. Folklore, from which folk derives its name, was the lore of the people, as seen in music, dance, fashion, and more. But say folk to anyone nowadays, and they will likely believe that you are referencing the folk revival that started in the 1940s in the USA and peaked somewhere in the early 60s. And I'm going to ruffle some feathers here and possibly will anger some people, but the folk revival did the exact opposite of what was inherent to original folk music. It started to gatekeep, dictate and dominate. People felt an ownership over what people played, what they sang and how they played it, culminating into what I and many others with me think was the death of the folk revival and maybe even folk in general.
I saw him here in Sheffield at the City Hall and I thought he was magnificent. And, I thought he just couldn't improve if he tried. Then the next thing that happened was he went really commercial with this backing group, and I didn't like that very much. I don't know what he's trying to do. I think he's conceding to to some sort of popular taste. I think it's a bad thing. I think he's I think he's prostituting himself.
Bob Dylan went electric. That's it. He chose to release a record and tour with rock instruments. The horror. Yet, he was called Judas by a crowd in Manchester, got booed at performances in New York, and was widely criticized by fans and peers alike for following what he deemed a logical trajectory in his music. Yeah, I guess black metal fans and folk purists aren't so different after all. What the folk revival, no matter how terribly snobbish and gatekeepy it was, did do was open up a whole wealth of songs and arrangements that were hitherto unknown to a younger crowd, leading to a renewed interest in the old stuff, yet eventually leading to the musical equivalent of a perpetually dry vagina. Of course, you can watch it on YouTube, but save yourself the trouble and let me paint you a picture. The year is 1981. On stage is the biggest doofus with the wildest hairdo you've ever seen, holding back a receding hairline. He is clad in a white shirt and black vest, standing stiffly on stage. His feet are firmly planted beside each other, and he is alternating between crossing his arms, holding his lapels, having his hands in his pockets, and hooking his thumbs in his belt loop. Such a dynamic stage presence. Now, imagine him backed up by a lot smaller doofus with a Lloyd Christmas haircut, wearing a children's bar mitzvah suit and a guitar that is easily 5 sizes too big for him. They're on stage. A stage made to look like a New York rooftop. It's Central Park in fucking New York. And here they sing a classic tune with about as much fervor and passion as a mother reading her child the same bedtime story for the millionth time in a row.
Tell her to make me a cambric shirt, parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, without no seam nor needlework.
This is about as far removed from rock and roll as is humanly possible, and it hurts to even listen to it. The enamel on my teeth cracks from the sheer sugary awfulness every time I hear it. It is, however, notable for the fact that the song itself was mostly written in the 16th century, or maybe even before that. It's one of hundreds of variants of a song called Scarborough Fair, which itself can be traced back to an old Scottish tune called The Elfin Knight. In its structure and melody, there are elements that we have come to expect from medieval folk music. The Dorian mode, layered vocals and weird riddle-like themes and lyrics, often referring to swords, sorcery, and mythical creatures. And in this case, the song, in its oldest recovered form, describes a magical elf threatening to kidnap a maiden unless she can somehow perform a number of seemingly impossible tasks, like sewing a shirt without hems, or stitches, or washing it in a dry well. This might be a very roundabout way to differ between folk black metal and medieval black metal, but I'm sure that if anything, you now know 2 things clearly. I don't like Simon and Garfunkel, and I love the movie Jaws. There is a certain mythical quality to the Middle Ages and the music that arose from it. And it's often that same mythical quality we find in the music inspired by it. If that music is any good, of course. So, for the sake of brevity, something I am absolutely not a master in so far, and to make the rest of this podcast as enjoyable as possible, I will now focus on a couple of examples out of dozens of bands who I feel are the most representative of the complete picture of medieval black metal, and who are actually good. Of course, I will list a number of other bands that I feel are worth a listen at the end of this episode, but for now I want to talk about these bands specifically because I feel that they highlight the variety that exists in the specific subgenre best. Of course, like everything metal, there are more than one band called Vehemence, or Vehemence, or any other way you could pronounce this. Today we are talking about the one with two acute accents or accent aigu in their name. One on the first E, the next on the second. If you would remove these, then you would probably find a little band from Phoenix, Arizona, who plays some very, very decent death metal. The accented one, though, is based several thousand kilometers to the east and several hundred to the north. Paris, France is the base of this medieval powerhouse. Formed in the 2010s by multi-instrumentalist Tulchka, they released their first album Assiège in 2014. It was not a success. And now, looking back on it 10 years later, it's not weird to see why. The medieval themes, still in their infancy, seem to be mostly apparent in the artwork. The intro flutes and marching drums of track Le Singe Respire Encore, which roughly translates to The Blood Still Breathes, which is hauntingly beautiful, and acoustic patchwork track Par sombre forêt et vaste plain, which title is not beautiful at all. In fact, it's pretty lame. And that is not to say that there is no value in the album. There is, but it's mostly a lo-fi work that leans more heavily on old-school Finnish black metal than the band's future inspirations. It also is Vehemence's only work with lead singer and lyricist BR, whose recorded work in black metal at least appears to start and end with this album. His voice is, well, okay. To be honest, it's nothing special, but it had the potential to grow into that. However, as it plays now, the one thing that stands out on the album is the guitar sound. It's sharp and menacing, and Morden does a good job over the programmed drums and stands strong against the mediocre vocals, which sounds like they were recorded during a different session or even in a different studio altogether.
Allons, mes frères, n'allons-nous pas ici une dernière fois, nos bannières.
Often an album like Assiège spells an end to a short band career. A fun reminder of an also-ran lost in the constant barrage of albums just like it. But such would not be the case for Vehemence. Weirdly, the band's official Spotify, the one where, to make things even more complicated, their name is spelled in all caps, makes no mention of the album at all. And you need to use lowercase letters with those damned acute accents to find it. Maybe that is the reason why it only has 83 monthly listeners, or it is simply because the rest of the band's output is vastly superior, and the band made the right decision of giving it a separate place on the streaming platform. I know I would have. Vehemence truly came into their own on 2019's follow-up album, Par le sang versé, translated by the blood shed. Everything about the album breathes Middle Ages. The cover shows a dragon in front of a castle, bleeding from a chest wound, while a knight drinks its blood from a chalice. The only lettering on the cover is a stylized letter V, and it looks like it was drawn by a monk in the 1300s. Instantly recognizable as a classic depiction of medieval legends. The music, however, is not as familiar as the album sounds, unlike anything else that was released before. From the first dissonant tones, the album feels like a siege on a fortress. Thomas Leitner's pummeling, sometimes tribal drums, and the group's shouted choirs, accentuated by the raspy screams of Current, a vastly superior lead singer, even more, feel more ancient than the electric guitar should allow for. This is a different band altogether, with songwriting and epic soundscaping lifted to a new height. The lyrics deal with matters of blood oaths, moonlit battles and horse rides through untamed wilderness. Take this for example. For those who do not speak French, allow me to translate. Friend, I warn you. Love is a dragon, thirsty for tears. In the dark wood, where I sometimes hunted, there was this strange glade. And one day I went there, saw a beautiful young girl and wanted to kiss her. In an instant the breath passed, I fell, and the shadow froze me. Now tell me, doesn't that sound like something written centuries ago? This is not angsty poetry screamed over tremolo picking, but these are actual bardic songs with story, melody, and depth. They contain beginnings, middles, and ends, verses, bridges, and choruses, while the music jumps between acoustic intermezzo and hyper-fast blast beats, whispered vocals, lutes, screams, and then add uplifting deep beat with actual moments of sonic ecstasy, only heard ever so often in a scene known for its dark and depressive sounds. And yes, doing all this in one song does tend to bloat the tracks from time to time, unfortunately. It is like Tulcha had so many great ideas, he just had to add them to the album no matter what, making these songs too much of a good thing every now and then. However, it is just a minor gripe when we listen to the sheer power and intensity of the album. And even though it was indeed a minor sour note and most likely purely my personal preference, 2022's follow-up Ordalie sidestepped all of that. It is heavier, faster, darker, and more powerful than any of Vehemence's earlier work, and it works on so many levels. The title translates to ordeals, and the band sounds like they have gone through some between these two records. Where much of medieval black metal is mostly acoustic interludes and flutes penetrating the blast beats, here they feel part of the material. It never feels forced, nor does it outstay its welcome. True, the songs are long, the shortest clocking at 7 minutes and demand attention, but they are worth the time they spend because even when the band is purely guitars, keys and blast beats and screams, it still sounds positively medieval. It is a masterclass in originality, and a true ode to the Middle Ages that never ventures into the territory of pastiche or gimmick. If there would have been black metal in the Middle Ages, I'm sure it would have sounded exactly like album closer Par la Glaive, By the Sword, a song title that is reflected in the album cover. In a work with a style almost similar to their previous album, we see two knights raising a burning sword, each ready to strike the other one on a field in front of a medieval bridge and castle. The drawing style having very much a look of a 13th century illustration again. The stylized letter V once again being the only indicator of who the artists are. It goes amazingly well with the music. It is a whirlwind of ancient anger, and the spirit of war blazes through everything that makes Vehemence such a unique and special band. You'll be hard-pressed to find anything that comes even close in its intent and authenticity, unless, that is, if you look across the Atlantic. Boston, Massachusetts is the home of Obsequiae. Yet, Boston might be a tad misleading since they haven't released any music after moving there from Minnesota in 2022. In fact, their last released album, The Palms of Sorrowed Kings, dates back to 2019. But it's not difficult to understand why it would have led to 5 years of zero recorded music. Because this album, as well as its predecessor, Area of Vernal Tombs, are dense, deep and inspired works that are not only insanely good, they are also very complicated and well-researched pieces of music. Guitarist, bassist, singer and songwriter Tanner Anderson, formerly going by Blondel de Nesle, is an avid student of medieval music and has built a solid sounding as well as written number of albums that are unlike anything else in music today. Besides the standard black metal weaponry of guitar and bass, he further wields the fantastically named hurdy-gurdy, the hammered dulcimer, both psaltery, the mizar and the zeal. Well, just Google them. Just Google them, okay? Backed by current drummer Owen McCluskey, going by Egon McCluskey, and flanked by Spanish medieval harpist Vincent La Camera Marino, the band sounds like a metal band first and foremost. There's no trick to be found, no indulgent instrumentation. All of the instruments are part of the song and are there in favor of that song, and not the other way around. And while it would have been completely understandable for Anderson to have gone off the deep end, he never does. There is a deep respect for both the ancient influences as much as there is for black metal, and the music benefits hugely from it. This is not folk metal, and the band explicitly voices their dislike of that genre. This is something different altogether. The beautiful instrumentals peppered throughout the album and played by the Spanish virtuoso are often 700 to 800 years old. Yet they only contrast the rest of the music in their respective levels of loudness, and I only know that they were written by the troubadours of the distant past because the band told me. Otherwise I would have still been none the wiser, as the rest of the albums have the same level of atmosphere and playfulness as these tracks have. Tanner, though I have listened to his music so much I should be on a first-name basis, writes his songs in the Dorian mode. The medieval Dorian mode, to be precise, where something does something with something in a certain something. You can probably tell that I'm not a theoretical guy and I have never been able to understand much of music theory at all, to be honest. However, in short, the Dorian mode is one of 8 modes or octo-echoes, which were the model the Byzantine Church developed for medieval chant. Looping us back somewhat to the beginning of our episode where we discussed the other medieval chants, those Gregorian ones. But I digress. The Dorian mode is known for being a minor scale that has a dark feel to it, but does not venture into the territories of real darkness and dramatics. So, perfect for the type of music Obsequy put out. Both albums that are available for streaming right now appear to follow a certain pattern where we have a beautiful cover of an ancient ruin. One a cathedral, the other a castle. And even these are very, very old. Although not medieval, they are photochromes of these places, taken in the late 19th century and are therefore the first recorded images of places even further back in time. I won't bother you with explaining how photochromes work, except to say that the process is extremely interesting and I encourage you to look into it if these things interest you in any way. What is most interesting about using these earliest pictures of these locales the music is derived from is that the music itself also becomes this vision of a time long since past, providing us with a glimpse of history using modern day equipment. It's like we are listening back in time along with the people playing it. And when thinking about their songwriting process, I have this image of Tanner poring over ancient scrolls and sheet music and combining the ingredients with black metal in an audio medium to have us listen back to what music must have been like, only louder. I know that the band never called themselves medieval black metal and would probably roll their eyes at just about everything I told you about them here, but if anything, they are one of the best reasons for this subgenre being legit, and that is a hill I'm willing to die on. Metaphorically, of course. So, with having talked about Sunopfer, Vehemans and Obsequies, we're pretty much set for current day examples of well-established medieval black metal bands. But what does the future hold? Are we to wait what Heltigvad will do to up the ante on their sophomore release? Because their guitarist, Simon Scott de Krook, did tell me that the band was looking to record a follow-up soon when I met the AFSCII live lineup in late 2023 at Soul Crusher Festival in Nijmegen. Yet I'm not holding out hope for that being more than the fun side of the AFSCII shining through. Which, in all fairness, is good enough for me. I love AFSCII. I'm sure Sunopfer will continue to put out excellent material, and I hope the same will be true for the other bands we discussed. But what bands do we need to keep our eyes on? Who is promising to break through in the coming years? One of those bands might just be Smyrna, with 3 members who only use their first initial and whose bass line comes from Czechia, while guitarist and singer M hails from Croatia, the 3 now residing in Prague. Have ample of promise and, based on their small recorded output, hold a lot of potential to become a future big name in this field. The screams that remind of Ole Pedersen Luke are interspersed with lower, more death metal adjacent growls and snarls, and there are bouzoukis and flutes incorporated into what so far is still mostly a straightforward black metal sound. But there is something there. It often resides just under the surface, but every once in a while it sticks its head above the waters of tremolo and blast beats, and mostly in the form of choirs and bridges that recall the past in other ways. Definitely want to look out for. Another one that I think might be a solid contender for a future popular release comes from a land that keeps on giving when it comes to this type of music, France. But this time, they do not come from Paris, but from Orléans. And I'm going to be clear straight away, this band is fun. Like really, really fun. Capital F, capital U, capital N. Epic, heroic, waving a banner on the ramparts while shouting obscene war cries to your enemies fun. So if that is not your cup of tea and you need your black metal to be depressive, then don't bother with their only recently released debut album. Les Bâtards du Roi, or The King's Bastards, if you would like an English translation, are loud, abrasive, and are one of those bands that make you hear they have a blast playing music together. Their names are Lancelot, because of course it is, Regicide, and Demonicus. And I am enamored with their debut. It is black metal with the spirit of the Middle Ages, and a small injection of hardcore and heavy metal from time to time, and it's just exhilarating to me. It does what some of the best black metal does, in that it has this jubilant, triumphant sound that all its screaming and crushing sound should not allow for. The medieval element is there, but I am certain that should they pursue it to a larger extent in their future output, they will become one of the standard bearers of this genre. And then on to the weirder side of things, because it can always be weirder, of course. 2 bands have taken up the mantle, quite literally, of medieval beekeeping. Both are 3-piece bands. One is from Basel, Switzerland and is called Viglios. The other from Ukraine and goes by They Came From Vision. but it would be quite hard, at least visually, to tell them apart. Both bands are dressed in the way of the subjects in the painting The Beekeepers and the Bird Nester by Peter Bruegel the Elder. Not surprisingly, Foweles even used this painting as the cover for their 2024 debut, Ome 1, Apide. Whether they were aware that the same painting was already used by the band's son, I do not know. What I do know, however, is that this is an absolute stellar debut that embraces the Beekeeper aesthetic fully. It is loud, it is rough, and it is mean. The band has even come up with a fantasy world theme where honey is somehow a form of currency and an evil straw king is hoarding it for himself, forcing the band members to attack his hive. I told you it would get weird. It is not, however, medieval in any other way than through some of the themes. It is old school black metal, and amazing old school black metal at that, so I'm sure we will talk about them again one day. They Came From Visions, however, is a band that is also relatively new, and their first 2 records show a huge potential. In fact, I would say that their latest, The Twilight Robes, is among the best releases of the year so far. It also carries quite a bit of medieval energy and in an original way as well. So I definitely believe that they hold more than a bit of future promise. Alright, well this has been the first of many, I hope, deep dives into a subgenre of the scene, and if anything, I am more than enthusiastic to dive into more in the future. I had a blast going down this particular rabbit hole, and although this episode was a lot more work than the earlier 2, I look forward to doing this again. So, I hope you had as much fun listening to it as I had making it. Thank you for listening to Blackfold. Now, for those liner notes. For a deeper dive into the time period, I read the book The Light Ages, The Surprising Story of Medieval Science by Sepp Falk. And although not a lot of what was written for this podcast came from it in particular, I do recommend this book to anyone who has an interest in finding out what the actual Middle Ages were like. Just pick it up and read it. It's an amazing book with great insights, and it tackles a lot of the misconceptions we have about the time period. For a better understanding of Gregorian chant, plain chant, monophonics, the Dorian mode, and many of the medieval instruments that came up in this episode, I went so deep down the rabbit hole that it would be another 15 minutes of me listing it all. Suffice it to say that I started on Wikipedia, and more often than not ended up on some obscure website of people way more knowledgeable about these things than I will ever be. However, I would like to suggest a couple of things that truly stood out. YouTube channel Music Theory Academy has a great 8-minute quick guide to medieval music. The YouTube channel Jamsville tried its best to explain the Dorian mode to me, but my limited understanding of musical theory left me just as baffled afterwards as I was before. The website TV Tropes has a very large collection of movies that uses Dies Irae. It is, however, not exhaustive. And you will probably, like me now, hear it crop up a lot when watching movies or television shows. I'm sorry about that. All other matters discussed should be pretty self-explanatory and easily found, either online or in your music players of choice. I did tell you that I would make some more recommendations on records that I would consider at least partly part of this subgenre and worth a listen. But consider this, my taste is by no means superior. In fact, it might often be the opposite if I count the many times I've been told off for liking something that was not cult enough. I think that Satyricon album Dark Medieval Times has been mentioned before quite a bit, but it's important enough to warrant another mention, as it is obviously and absolutely fair to give credit where credit is due. It is one of the records that shaped the scene, and it is awesome. The incorporation of acoustic and folk elements were unique at the time, and it still works really well. Of course, the record is meant to sound like it was recorded in a vacuum cleaner at 5 in the morning on a Thursday. However, the 2021 remaster makes it a much better listening experience. Another band I would suggest is Skeleton Brute, a band from Utah that released a pretty awesome record with 2013's Echoes of Battle before going completely silent. Also, Ungfell from Switzerland have a pretty interesting discography which I recommend. In fact, I will just list some albums and bands now that I think would give at least some pleasure to anyone at all interested. And I will refrain from delving too deep into any side notes, which I'm apt to do. So besides the albums discussed earlier, give the following a listen. Ungfell and the album Mythen, Mer and Pestilence, Sunopfar with Nous sommes d'hier, Summoning, Old Morning's Dawn, Stormkeep with their album Tales of Other Time, Darkenhold, Arcanes and Sortileges, Godkiller with the Rebirth of the Middle Ages, what's in her name, Abigor, Nachthymnen, Mistras, Castles Conquered and Reclaimed, and lastly Zeit der Dunkelheit, Die letzten Tage. We have used the snippets of music in this episode on a fair use basis, and have included them as a way of explaining the music that fuels the stories, and have no financial incentive in sharing these snippets as such. Our theme music is performed by Spectral Wound and is used with their permission. If you would like to hear more from them, look for the only band called Spectral Wound wherever you get your music, or visit their Bandcamp page and buy some of their amazing merch. This podcast was written and recorded by me, Danny van Eyck. Audio engineering and production by Mick Schouten, and technical assistance, editing and encouraging words came from Björn Bolderdijk. We are on Instagram as Blackfold Podcast, all one word. So give us a follow and share your feedback in the comments if you want to. Join us for episode 4 next week.